Hi everyone. In this video we're looking at the next part of Philippians chapter 1, 27 through to 2 verse 11. And if you want to see the previous videos in this series, then I'll put a link up there and you can click on that and you can watch the previous ones as well. Now, the other day I was in the car and we were stuck in traffic, and as I was waiting, I was looking out the window and I just saw another man in the car sort of next to us. He had his arm out the window and I could see on his arm there was a tattoo which said something like, "If you don't live for something, you'll die for nothing. If you don't live for something, you'll die for nothing." That was what he had on his arm. And it just made me think, that everyone has something to live for. Now, everyone's life has some kind of shape, whether that be maybe children or family, or maybe work, or all sorts of different things, perhaps money, all sorts of different things which kind of are at the centre of our lives and which give our lives their shape. And as I was thinking, I wondered what his life was. What was it which was the thing that he lived for? And I wonder, if I asked you, what would you say would be the thing which gave your life shape, which was at the centre of your life? And the Bible does say and talk about what should be at the centre of our lives and what should give our life shape. And that's what this passage in Philippians is about, and helps us to think about, what is it that our lives should look like? What gives them shape? And particularly in the face of difficult circumstances, what should our lives look like in those circumstances? So that's what we're going to be looking at. And just to remind you that I won't read the passage out in its entirety, but if you'd like to read it for yourself, then I'll put the link down below and you can have a look at that. And just a little reminder, please do click the like button, click the subscribe button, the thumbs up or whatever, and please do share this video with anyone who you think might like it. I do appreciate that, and I appreciate that you listening and taking the trouble to do these things. It does help me out, so thank you. So just before we begin, just quickly to talk about the context of this letter. I think we have mentioned this a bit going through, but I just want to put this into context, that there was division and disunity going on in the church that Paul was writing to. This was not a united church, and we can see that in what Paul says here. But elsewhere later on in the letter, he pleads with a couple of people to be reconciled with each other, and perhaps there'd been disunity in people disagreeing with the leadership, because sort of Paul talks a bit like he begins the letter to talk to God's holy people together with the overseers and deacons, with their leaders, which is a very unusual way for Paul to begin his letters. So maybe there's disunity, and particularly people who were dissatisfied with their leadership. And also they were undergoing suffering and persecution for the sake of the gospel. We don't know what exactly that looked like, but people were being hostile to them because the Philippian church believed in Jesus and were preaching about Jesus. So that's persecution was going on. So Paul, into that situation, he says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. So he says, look, it doesn't matter what the situation is, you need to conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. The gospel that you've heard, it should affect the way that you've been living. The gospel should make a difference in the way that you treat others, in the way that you handle these situations. The gospel is not something which is just kind of there, and we get our sins forgiven and that's great, but then it makes no difference to the rest of our lives. Now Paul's saying that the gospel should give our lives a shape, should kind of give our lives the centre, which everything else fits around, and should make a difference in every part of our lives. And so he says, explains a bit what that means. He says, so when I come and see you, I'll know that you stand firm in the one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. So he is saying, look, unity, being one, is part of what it means to live a gospel-shaped life. To be united with other Christians as the church is part of what it means to live a gospel-shaped life. Now, sometimes people ask me, or say to me usually, "Oh, you can be a Christian without going to church." And I think, well, in a sense, yes, that is technically true. No, I go and do home communion with people who can't get out anymore, and they're not lesser Christians because they're housebound. But at the same time, one very important thing about being a Christian is loving and being united to other Christians. When you become a Christian, you join a whole new family. And part of our existence now as Christians is to love and help other Christians who are part of our family now. And so that's the thing, that it's not about going to a building on a Sunday morning or whenever it happens to be, but actually being part of a family. The church is like a family, and so we are to fulfill that role as part of our service of Christ, to be part of his family now. It just reorients our priorities. And being one with other Christians is really important, not kind of being grumbling against them or being mean to them or whatever, but being united is really important. And that's part of what it means to live a gospel-shaped life. And so Paul, he goes on and explains a bit more about what this looks like and what this means. So he says, don't be frightened in any way by those who oppose you. He's saying, look, this suffering that you're going through, the persecution that you're going through, don't be afraid of them. You don't have to be afraid of persecution. At the end of the day, Jesus said, don't fear those who can kill the body and after that can do no more, but fear the one who, once your body has been destroyed, can cast both soul and body into hell. So Jesus says that we shouldn't fear other human beings, but rather we should fear God instead. And this is what Paul says here. Don't fear the human beings who are against you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. Saying, look, just look to what God's doing. God's going to save you because you believe and trust in him. God won't save those others because they do not believe and trust in him. And it says, this is a key verse, I think, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. And Paul talks about how he himself is going through those same kind of struggles. And this is the thing, that the Christian life is not a life of ease, but it is actually a life often with persecution. That it doesn't take very long, unfortunately, of being a Christian to find out that many people don't really like Christians. Many people don't really want to know. Many people would just rather get on with their lives without any of this Jesus business coming. And I think that's because people have an inkling that it's true, but they just rather not think about it because they want the freedom to live their lives in the way that they want to live, on their own terms, rather than on God's terms. And so people don't like Christians. And all throughout history this has been the case. There was actually a report just very recently about how much Christians were being persecuted. The Christians are the most persecuted people group on the planet as of just quite recently. And this is a new report that's been done. And Christians are being persecuted all over the world. It's just a natural way that things happen. Even in the UK at the moment, then yes, Christians aren't in danger of being killed, but if you become a Christian, you might lose your friends, your family might not want to talk to you, all sorts of things might happen. And sometimes even people lose their jobs or whatever because they're a Christian. And that Jesus says, and Paul says, that's just normal. That actually being a Christian means having this kind of opposition. And for some people it'll be worse than others. If you live in North Korea, you might get killed even for being a Christian. But persecution is just part and parcel. And it's something that God uses in our lives. God uses it for good, to help us and to purify us. That's why persecution is there. It helps us to focus more on Jesus and not on all of the things in this world which might distract us from that. So persecution, God gives it for a reason, and it's for our good that it happens in the long run. But it doesn't make it easy, but it is for our good. And this is why Paul talks in the way that he does. So he goes on to say, this is at the beginning of chapter 2 now, so he says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. So Paul says, look, if you have any kind of communion with Christ, if you're with him any way, if you're united with Christ, you're united with his love and so on, then you need to be like him. And the way that you need to be like him is by loving one another, being one in spirit, being of the same love, being of one mind. You need to love others in the way that Christ loves. Now, if you're united to Christ by faith, then you need to start showing that same love to others. And one of the problems in times of persecution, particularly in the church, is that of disunity, I think. When people come against the church, then it can mean that people think, oh, well, I don't like this persecution, we should change and become more like the world so we don't get persecuted. And other people might say, oh, I don't like this, we're only being persecuted because you're saying things in the wrong way, you're not being gracious or kind enough, so stop that. And there can be a lack of harmony. And Paul says, now, if you're united to Christ, you need to be like him, have his love and have one spirit and one mind. He says, don't do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. He says, don't look to your own kind of interests, selfish ambition, vain conceit. Don't look to yourself and try to build yourself up, build your own empire. But he says, rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Don't look just to your own interests, but to those of others. That's the way to combat this. To look not just to our own interests, but look to see if we can serve others and build them up and help them. So if someone is saying something, perhaps in an ungracious way, then perhaps seek to help them, to pray for them, rather than just to say, oh, you're doing that wrong. Or perhaps if someone is calling for us to change, maybe listen to them and talk about it and work it through and try to help them and come to a better understanding of what we should be saying, instead of kind of causing needless division. And Paul is just this having the same mindset that Jesus had, that Paul is going on about. And this is what he goes on to say: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then he goes on in this is sometimes called the Christ hymn. I mean, some people think that this was a hymn which was written before Philippians, which maybe they would have been familiar with, or maybe Paul composed it, but whatever it is, it's a wonderful picture of Jesus Christ, and he is our model, our pattern. Now, he's the one, the gospel shaped one, if you like, who we should be following. His whole life was gospel shaped, and we should be seeking to emulate him in our lives and seeking to kind of put this into practice in the way that we relate to others, especially in the church. So Paul says he was he being in very nature God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. So Jesus, although he was in very nature God, he didn't consider that as something to be used to his own advantage. He didn't look to his own interests, but instead he became a servant to serve others, and particularly to serve us, to serve those who come to believe in him. And Paul's saying that's the attitude that we should have, not looking to our own privilege or to our own kind of things, but rather thinking about how we can use what we've been given to serve others, rather than just seeking to grab stuff for our own gain. And being found, it says, in appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Paul's been talking about suffering and how suffering is part of the Christian life. Well, Jesus suffered the ultimate sacrifice. He became obedient even to death on a cross. And when we think about suffering being part of the Christian life, we often don't welcome it as part of our lives. But actually Jesus, he was obedient to God even to death. And Jesus knew that was what he had to do. It was part of the plan that God had for him. And he was obedient and did it. I have heard it once said, I can't remember who said this, one of the Puritans I think, that Christ went more willingly to the cross than we go to the throne of grace. Jesus went willingly to the cross because he was being obedient to his Father. That how often when persecution comes our way do we turn around and say, oh, I don't like this, oh, I don't like this at all, oh God, this is horrible, blah blah blah, and we just complain and moan about it. But actually Jesus was obedient even to the point of death, and we need to have his mindset. But there is good news. There is good news with how it finishes. It says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So because Jesus humbled himself and was obedient even to death, then God exalted him and gave him the name above every name. So Jesus was the one who most humbled himself in all of the, I was going to say all of human history, but in the whole world. He's the most humble because he had equality with God, and yet he became nothing. He became a servant to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so therefore God exalted him. And this is all the picture throughout the Bible, that as we humble ourselves, then God will lift us up. And I was thinking about this and thinking this is a picture of what it's like to be united to others. That the way to be united to others is to be humble. It's through humility, not having too high an opinion of ourselves, not thinking that, oh, I'm so great that everyone needs to hear my opinion, that everyone needs to, I need to be able to use my gifts and exercise them in the way that I choose. But we should look to be humble and put others first, as Jesus did. And that as we come to Christ and as we understand more of the gospel, this should be more the case in our lives. That our lives should start taking on more and more of a gospel shape as we understand more of the gospel. And this is why Paul is talking in the way that he does. He's saying, look, you understand the gospel. Now, let's start living it out in your lives. There's division among you. There shouldn't be division among you. How does the gospel impact on that? And it could be the same in any different area, in many different sort of areas in our lives, as we think how the gospel changes us in the way that we relate to difficult situations, the way that we maybe relate to difficult people, or the way that we just kind of listen and put others first, rather than seeking to put ourselves first all the time. But the gospel gives our lives a shape, and that is the way that it's supposed to be. So I hope that you found this helpful in thinking through Philippians. I'm really enjoying looking at this book. It's a wonderful book in the New Testament. Just thinking about Jesus Christ, what the gospel does for us, and how it makes a difference in our lives. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again for another one of these videos very soon. So thank you very much for watching, and God bless.